Hi guys, this is Leila. She's the CEO of Samasource. So she's located right here in the Mission.
Yeah.
And very cool work. She founded the company about 5 years ago or so. And what they do is they provide dignified, high-quality work to people in usually developing countries, women and children, and allow them to basically make better lives and better incomes and doing less demanding work. So she started this company from the ground from day one. It was her idea. And it's now built into an amazing, very successful company that's been well received by many organizations and many people around the world. And most importantly, it's helped just a ton of people, make more money and live a better life. So she's going to tell you her story about how she started it, all the trials and tribulations, and feel free to ask questions as she speaks.
Cool. So I think we have about 30 minutes, but I wanted to keep it short to like maybe 15, and then we can do Q&A. So this is a charter school, right? Ish?
So the school we're in is a charter school.
Okay.
The program is, so these students are from all over South Bay, locally in East Bay.
Okay, cool. And the program is to do hands-on design thinking type work?
Yeah, hands-on engineering.
Awesome. It's relevant. I went to a math and science high school, which emphasized hands-on engineering and math and science, so I have a soft spot for curriculum like this. And I think this will totally prepare you guys to be entrepreneurs in the future. That's what you want to do, or to be entrepreneurial in whatever career you choose. So I am part of a small group here of social entrepreneurs in the Bay Area. Social entrepreneur is just an entrepreneur, but who forms a venture that has a social mission at its core, right? So you guys might have heard of organizations like Kiva, a microloan website where you can give money to someone who's poor and who's starting a business on the other side of the world. And there's a group of us here now forming a nice organization in the Bay Area. So Samasource got started about 5 years ago, and my mission when I formed the organization was to figure out a new way to fight poverty in poor countries. When I was about your age, are you guys what, 16-ish, yeah, 15, 16, I got a scholarship from a tobacco company, one of these like big bad tobacco companies in Maryland. And I felt really guilty using $10,000 from this tobacco company to send myself to college. And so I decided that I would use the money for something else. I also was lucky to take advantage of California's program where you can take classes in a college if you're a high school student, so I had a lot of college credit, so I could graduate a semester early. So I convinced my guidance counselor that it was a good idea to let me go a semester early so that I could go off to Africa. I found a program online. These were the very early days of the internet. Looked nothing like what you guys have now. And I found this random program in Ghana, of all places, which is in West Africa, to go and teach blind kids English. I had no experience teaching. I really had no idea what I was getting into. I just wanted to have an adventure, and I wanted to spend this dirty tobacco money on something that seemed a little bit better. So I signed up to be a volunteer. And I showed up in a small village in Ghana in 2000, I think it was in January of the year 2000. And I had 60 students, and I had to learn Braille and figure out how to teach these kids English. Now, before I got to Ghana, I had thought that people in poor countries were poor because they were, sitting around eating coconuts and mangoes and not really wanting to work. That was the stereotype I had in my head. And I also thought people really didn't have skills. So I thought I'd go there and teach these poor kids English and enlighten them to this whole new world. And I got there, and my students were incredibly bright. They could name US senators. They were like more savvy than some of my high school peers were in Los Angeles. And I thought, this is so strange. This is such a myth that I've learned about poverty. And everybody in the community that I lived in, a small town called Akron, it's about 3 hours outside of the capital of Ghana, everybody that I met was an entrepreneur of some kind. Nobody was sitting around eating coconuts and mangoes. People were working crazy hours to try to make ends meet, and the average income was about $2 a day. And you might think, well, $2 doesn't buy you much in San Francisco, but surely in a place like Ghana, $2 gets you really far, right? Well, people don't realize that those numbers, when you hear them, the dollar a day figures, those are adjusted for purchasing power. So that's the equivalent of $2 in American dollars in 2005. And now we know that about 4 billion people around the world make less than $3 a day, and that's already adjusted for purchasing power. So imagine being let loose in San Francisco with $3 in your pocket in '05, and you'll have some idea of what the average person has to go through in a developing country. So I saw this firsthand. I lived in this community for 6 months. My town had no running water. There was one phone line. I distinctly remember calling my mom to find out which colleges I got into. And it was April 1st when I called her, and she initially said, so this was the one phone line, and it hadn't been working for quite a while. And finally it was working again, so I called my mom, and I'm like, Mom, can you tell me, tell me the news? And she's like, I'm so sorry. You got into none of the colleges you applied to. And I almost had a heart attack, and then like 5 seconds later she goes, April Fools. And I got really mad because I thought, there's only one phone line. If it goes down, I could have gone crazy trying to figure out this information. So it was a really rural and poor setting. But after the time that I was in Ghana, after learning how people there lived and after learning how much human capital there existed, I became really confused. It was really strange that this country where people were willing to work so hard and where so many people spoke really good English and knew all sorts of facts about the world and were incredibly passionate about learning, it was strange that this country was so poor. So I decided to study that, and I went into international development. I went to Harvard and I studied economic development with many scholarships, but none from tobacco companies. And I ended up really going further into the problem and learning that there weren't really very many good solutions. So at the time, the predominant thinking in the international development and poverty alleviation world was that the best way to solve some of these problems was to give people handouts of some kind or infrastructure. So big organizations like the World Bank and like many big development institutions were giving lots of money to poor country governments so that those governments could do stuff to help poor people on the ground. But every time I went to a poor country and I talked to someone locally, talked to the villagers that I lived with in Ghana, they all told me the same thing. They said, well, it's wonderful that you guys are building this bridge, nearby, or it's wonderful that you're working on this big water project, but we don't see any benefit from that. And the best way to help us, the best way to help individuals who are living on $2 a day is to figure out a way to employ us, to give us good jobs. And they told me about some of the things that they did to earn a living, and I was astounded. I met guys who spent 12 hours a day working as rickshaw pullers when I was living in India, so pulling a cart with people in the back, right? Who made less than $1.50 at the end of 12 hours of hard labor. I met coal miners who had similar experiences. I met people who were employed as domestic workers, who didn't have any rights, who were completely abused, who made less than $2 a day for a full day's work. And I thought, this is crazy, right? There's all this human capital in these countries and all of these people looking for work, but why can't we find more ways to employ them? And I decided when I was about 21 that I wanted to form some kind of organization that would create jobs for very low-income people that were dignified and that treated them fairly, and that I would dedicate my life to poverty alleviation through this method, through job creation. So after I graduated from college, I went and worked for a consulting firm for a couple years to pay back my loans. And in 2008, I quit my job and started Samasource. Sama means equal in Sanskrit. And Samasource takes big projects from technology companies in the Bay Area, like eBay and LinkedIn and Google.com, and we break them down into really small units of work that we can train very low-income people to do. So people who don't have any computer skills, who are literate in English, but maybe don't have any advanced work skills. And the tasks include things like tagging images. So do you guys know Getty Images? Have you heard of that website? Getty Images is an image library that sells content to a lot of websites. So if you see pictures of celebrities on like Yahoo News, those pictures are more often than not provided by a library like Getty. So we have workers now around the world from very low-income communities, from slums in India and East Africa to rural areas, tagging images for Getty. So that's just one example of a task that we do. We also have trained people to write product descriptions for websites. So if you go on like Walmart.com, I just bought a bike on that website a couple weeks ago, and you're looking for the right product to buy, it's actually very likely that the product description that you see on the website was written by a Samasource worker from a really low-income community. So the model is originally was really simple. I would just go and find these contracts from tech firms out here, and I partnered with guys who ran computer centers, men and women who were entrepreneurs in developing countries like Ghana, we started in Kenya, who were running computer centers that had between 10 and 50 computers. And originally I went to these guys and I was like, you're probably not making very much money running your internet cafe. People in a lot of these countries can't afford to spend much to use the internet. And so why not take these computers that you already have and monetize them? And I'll give you a new way to earn money using these computers. So these entrepreneurs were psyched to get work from Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley was excited to provide jobs to really low-income people. So initially I was just basically brokering these deals. And over time we grew into an organization that now employs about 800 people globally. So we have 16 centers in 9 countries. In East Africa, South Asia, we have a center in Haiti that has about 25 people that got started after the earthquake. And we just opened a program in the Bayview district that's at the Y. So we train low-income community college students here in the States to do online work to earn supplemental income. And we have about 40 staff based in an office here at 16th and Mission, and also in Nairobi in Kenya. We've got about 10 people out there. So the organization's really taken off. As a nonprofit, we've been pretty successful raising funds. It's really difficult to do. We started the month that the recession started in September 2008. Not the best time to start a nonprofit and ask people for money, but somehow we survived, and we got grants from a number of big foundations who were excited about this new concept, which we now call impact sourcing. The idea that you can promote poverty alleviation by hiring people, by giving them jobs rather than by giving them handouts. And Samasource led me to think about a bigger idea, which is the Sama Group, a family of enterprises that are all set up as nonprofit or social mission businesses that create jobs in really poor places. So through the Sama Group, we launched our US pilot, which we call Sama USA, and we have ambitions to extend that into prisons and into other areas where people don't have any good traditional employment and where jobs can really solve a lot of social issues. And we also launched something called Sama Hope. I brought these for you guys. These are little postcards. I'll pass them around. Sama Hope is a little bit different. We train, mixing things up a little bit. We have a website, samahope.org, that lets you fund through a crowdfunding model a medical treatment for someone on the other side of the world. So we took some of the learnings from building technology at Samasource, we've got an engineering team of about 6, and applied it to start a crowdfunding site like Kickstarter. You guys know Kickstarter?
Yeah.
Kickstarter, but for medical treatments. So you can choose a person whose surgery you'd like to fund and apply $20 or more towards that person's critical treatment. And right now we have a couple different types of surgery on the site. So the vision is to build a group of enterprises that share the same brand and that share a common mission to use technology to bring about social justice. So I'll leave it at that and open it up for questions if you guys have any.
So like you went to Africa like in your last semester of high school?
Yeah.
So like when you went there, like before you went there, did you have like any like hopes, like what you thought you'd achieve by going there?
To Africa?
Yeah.
Oh man, I thought I was going to save the world. I thought I was going to like come to this community and teach these poor kids English and then their lives would be better. And I had these grand ambitions, and I think it's changed a lot actually because of the internet. Like we were able to see how people live more directly now than we could back then. But I still think that there's a savior mentality to a lot of international aid programs. Like we think of ourselves as these great saviors, and we think of people on that end as these sort of helpless victims. And I certainly thought that before I went there. I thought, oh my God, here's a place where nobody can read and write, and I'm going to have to teach them the basics. And I got there, and they're like reciting, Langston Hughes poems and like telling me about U.S. politics and listening to Voice of America and BBC Radio. So I think the biggest learning for me was that there's a huge disparity in opportunity between the wealthy nations and the poor nations, and it has nothing to do with talent. Like, I've seen the most incredibly smart people in really poor settings in villages in rural Africa who just have no chance to exercise their skills or their talent. And I think that's the biggest tragedy in the world, that we're not making use of the incredible human capital in all of these poor places.
What kind of challenges do you face as a women entrepreneur?
Good question. I just kind of looked around and noticed that you guys are,
Oh, yeah.
guys. We got a couple girls. Why is that, by the way? It's not a guys-only class. Interesting.
This is actually not representative of the, so we're in Houston and New York. We do better in those cities. It's a challenge for us here. This is the first year in San Francisco, so it's something we're working on and we're aware of. But yeah, it's not something we succeeded on this year.
Yeah. We'll recruit your female friends, I guess, in future years.
Robots and stuff.
It was like that for me. Be surprised. I did when I was in high school. But I was also like one of probably like 5 girls who was taking upper level physics classes when I was in high school. So for whatever reason, I actually think that it's an advantage in a lot of ways. Like, I think the generation before mine had a lot more challenges, and people would overtly say like ridiculous things in boardrooms, and people would, like, if you were a woman, ask you to get coffee. That kind of thing doesn't really happen to me that much. I've been at a conference once or twice where I remember one, it was a very elite Silicon Valley conference where there were about 250 people, and I counted 8 women. And I was asked 3 times who I was there with, like as if I was the spouse of an entrepreneur, because I couldn't possibly have been an entrepreneur myself. And that sort of thing, like, you laugh at. It's not, people aren't deliberately trying to be mean or isolate you. They just genuinely think that you must be there as someone's spouse because they can't fathom, that you might be an entrepreneur. And that happens occasionally in the tech world, not too often. But more often than that, I'm encouraged. Like, I've been asked to be featured on so many different websites, and we've gotten so much PR out of the Women in Tech thing that I wouldn't have gotten if I were just a guy. And that's really helped the business. I feel a little bit weird about it, about being highlighted as a woman entrepreneur. I think what's cool about my organization should be cool regardless of the gender of the person who founded it. But I think as an entrepreneur, you have to milk whatever opportunities come your way, and we've happily milked that.
What's like the next step for your organization? Do you plan to expand more, or start new programs, things like that?
Yeah, well, my problem is that I have like too much energy and too many ideas, and if it were up to me, I'd be like sleeping 5 hours a night and building new Sama businesses every other month. But I think one of the challenges of being an entrepreneur, and most entrepreneurs I know are really high energy and have like books of ideas. The biggest challenge is to stay focused and stay on course and be able to channel your energy into a longer term plan. So with Samasource, that longer term plan is to deepen our relationships in the countries that we're in. So 9 countries is pretty broad, and we have quite a lot of work to do to go deeper in those geographies. In India alone, we have estimated that there are about 4 million people that could benefit from our services, so we could decide to grow in India alone and hit our impact goals. We want to reach 125,000 people in the next 5 years. We've currently lifted about 14,000 people over the poverty line since we started, with a model that keeps people employed for about 10 months and then shifts them into higher paying work locally or onto online work on different websites. So the goal is to expand that, and right now we're doing that by deepening our relationships with corporate partners. So we have signed in the last 2 quarters, Walmart.com, LinkedIn, Microsoft, and Getty Images, which are all really large companies that could scale to thousands of workers in the next year if we do it right. And then the vision with the Sama group is to build these enterprises opportunistically. So Sama Hope started, I was on a trip to Sierra Leone a couple years ago. Do you guys know where that is? It's in West Africa. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. And the whole idea for Sama Hope came about. The woman who's on this picture, Tiange, I met her and I took this picture last summer. And I went to this clinic where this picture was taken for the first time, I think now 2.5 years ago, and had the idea for it. I wasn't planning to build a website to crowdfund medical treatments, but I was sitting in this clinic and I was visiting the country for Samasource and listening to this doctor tell me his challenges raising money. And I thought it was crazy that the statistic is on the front that 1 in 14 women die in childbirth in Sierra Leone today in 2013, which is ridiculous, which shouldn't be tolerated. We have all the solutions for it. It's not like we don't know how to prevent this problem. We just haven't given enough money to these clinics to perform more of these operations and create more safe birth opportunities. So I was sitting there thinking, like, this doctor shouldn't be trying to figure out how to fundraise. He's a surgeon. He should be giving more surgeries. And people like me who don't have medical degrees should be focused on figuring out the fundraising problem. So the idea for that came about opportunistically. I was in the field, had the idea, and then this doctor connected me to the guy who made his website, who got really psyched about a crowdfunding website for surgeries and then built one. And then we launched it, and it was pretty grassroots, and now we've funded over 100 patients, and it's kind of growing on its own. So that model works really well for me. I tend to start things if the right things come together at the same time, if the right co-founders come into place and we get some funding from someone. Otherwise, I'm pretty focused on just growing Samasource.
How do you manage the team? Like, it seems like you're doing a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're very broad, you're doing everything around the world. So, like, how were you able to keep the team together?
So for the first 3.5 years, it was pretty much just Samasource. We had thought about expanding into the U.S., but we were pretty focused on the geographies that we were in. And those two started by having partners in the field approach us. So we didn't say we have this grand strategy and we want to reach India and East Africa and Haiti. We said, this is our model, and anyone who runs a computer lab in a developing country who meets our criteria, you're welcome to apply. And then they would apply to join our network, and we would then screen those applications and bring partners on that way. I really like those models. Those are called pull models versus a push model, where you show up in a place and you try to find the partners yourself and bring them on. Pull models are really great because they indicate an interest locally that is independent of you, right? So if you have a group of local entrepreneurs in a city who all want to bring your website or your organization to that city, you're much more likely to succeed than if you just show up there and you're trying to market to people. So that's originally how we expanded geographically. And the team, when we started, it was just me. It was like me sitting in a co-working space at 8th and Folsom in Soma. And I was sitting there like pretending like we were this big company, and I had like these inquiries I'd get online, and then I would personally manage all of the projects on a website called Basecamp. It's like a project management system. So those were the early days. And I hired someone off of Craigslist to do sales for me, and then got our first grant, and we started building a team. And now we have a really experienced leadership team. So we have a head of engineering who previously worked at an agency and managed 100 engineers. And we have a COO who took the company public in the 90s and worked at Kleiner Perkin, which is a big VC around here. So we've been able to bring on senior management that is capable of overseeing a wide range of geographies. And then with each of the other enterprises, the approach I've taken is modeled after what Richard Branson does, which is he carves off a new entity and basically silos it. So with our US program, we've treated it like an entirely separate business. It's like a startup within our company. So it's run by a separate team. The bank account is different. The branding is slightly different. If you go to our website at samasource.org/SamaUSA, you can see it. The programming is different, and we've intentionally done that to allow that team independence to do what they want to do. BSE. To pitch a big foundation, you need to write a 40-page grant application, and often you need to be invited to apply. And the hurdles are pretty high. They create large barriers to entry, so they don't get a lot of unsolicited proposals. So in the early days, I was literally like emailing hundreds of foundations, hundreds of program officers. I would go and accost them at conferences. I remember I did a couple of business plan competitions, and some of the judges were representatives of foundations, and I would go up to them and say, would you ever consider Samasource? And they're like, well, I think what you're doing is great, but come back to me in 6 months. And I would send them email after email. So some of the early conversations were just really hard to hear. I was turned down by one really well-known foundation in the area called Draper Richards. Now they're called Draper Richards Kaplan. But I remember putting together a book like this thick for their due diligence. I had a board member come with me. I created this huge financial model in Excel. I had all of these beautiful slides. I had a 40-page business plan. Like, this was the most planned business you'd ever seen. And I had this binder with all these tabs in it, to go over all the business. And I pitched them for about 6 months, hard. Like, we had several meetings, I brought in board members, et cetera, and then they turned us down and they didn't even offer us any feedback. And then finally they gave us some feedback and they said, well, you know, we just think it's gonna be really hard for you to teach these like poor women in Kenya how to do IT skills. Like, you know, we think it's too much, it's too high level for them. So the best way to address that, if you think that you're onto something, and you do need some signal that you're onto something. For me, the signal was I was actually winning small contracts, and they were actually getting completed by the workers we found. So it was working at a small scale, and that was the best evidence that it could grow. And so to me, the best, you know, solution kind of feedback is to come back and say, well, you said it wasn't gonna work, but here's evidence that it's working. And just to keep building that evidence at a small pilot level. We were rejected by the Rockefeller Foundation initially, which is a huge name in our sector. They're like the biggest VC in the poverty alleviation world. And they said, you know, this will never work. How are you going to train people from slums? These people need water and food before they need digital work. It's too complicated for them. I think part of this is that the foundation world is still not as techy as most of Silicon Valley, so people, even at those foundations, aren't really familiar with digital work, so they can't imagine somebody in a slum doing it. But they turned us down originally, and I went back and I kept showing them new data. I'd go to the field, I'd take pictures of these computer labs, I'd take pictures of people doing work, I'd record videos on my flip cam, and slowly but surely we started changing people's mind. And after a while, the evidence became so overwhelming that it was working. After we got to about $400,000 in contracts, people were like, oh, this is actually a viable business model, and if you can make this work, let's see if we can pour some gas on it. So, but I mean, I was literally rejected by pretty much everyone. Google also rejected us initially. Now they're both a client and a donor, but in the early days, they were like, well, I don't know how you're gonna get good quality work out of these random people in Kenya, you know, do they even have the skills to do this? So the proof is in the pudding, I guess, for us now.
Did you ever doubt yourself that it might not actually work, or did you always kind of just press on, reading that you like?
All the time. Oh man, that's the hardest thing, right? You're your own worst enemy, because at the end of the day, you know, when all of the people who you believe in, who are the leaders in your field, tell you that your idea sucks. Not all of them in my case. I had a few people say, this is a great idea, you know, we should pursue it. But the vast majority of the establishment said it was not a good idea. Totally, I doubted myself. And I saw my friends who were in like banking jobs making a lot of money, and I was at the time, I ran out of cash. This was another really low point. In 2008, so I quit my job in early 2008, right before I was supposed to get my bonus, which was a stupid idea. I should never have done that. So I moved out here, and I had about $10,000 in savings, and then I had won a couple of business plan competitions, so we had like $40,000 to start the organization, which really wasn't much even then. And so I started running out of money, and I had to take an SAT tutoring job on the side. And so here I was, like, I had given up my corporate Amex card and my really nice apartment in New York and my swanky job, which flew me business class everywhere, to move to like a spot I found on Craigslist in Mountain View and like see all of my friends do really well in their careers. I had a bunch of friends who were working at Facebook, which was blowing up then, and I felt like the uncool kid who, like, you know, whose friends are all going to like the best prom in the world, and I'm just staying at home. That's how I felt. And then to make matters worse, I ran out of money at one point, so I had to go and sleep on my friend's futon for a month and a half, which turned out to be a really good thing for me. But I think what happened at that point was I realized that the worst case scenario is I don't have a lot of money and I have to do an odd job on the side, and really that's not that big a deal. Like, it was not so bad to not have very much money, and I was still happier being broke but doing something that I loved than I was with my fancy corporate job. So that really helped. And then the other thing that gave me faith was reading the stories of entrepreneurs who've done really bold things before. So I highly recommend, if you guys have heard about Muhammad Yunus. Do you know him? He's the founder of Grameen Bank. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006 for inventing the concept of microfinance. So in the 70s, he had finished his economics PhD. He was working as an econ professor in his native country of Bangladesh. And he went to this village to try to understand poverty. and noticed that one of the biggest problems that people in the village faced, who were small-time entrepreneurs running really tiny businesses, was that they couldn't get any access to capital. They couldn't even get like a $100 or a $50 loan. So imagine how hard it is to run a business if no bank will loan you any money. You can never scale. So he said, well, why don't I try an experiment? Why don't I loan money to these women entrepreneurs and see if they'll pay me back? And he did it, and the women actually miraculously paid him back. And then he went and told all these banks, he's like, why aren't you loaning to really low-income women who make like $2 a day? If you loan them $50, you can totally transform their businesses, and they'll even pay you back. And the bank said, no way, these people aren't financially literate. It's very much the same story that I heard. These people aren't capable, they'll never pay you back, they're poor because they don't know how to handle money. And so he said, okay, if you don't believe me, I'm going to keep trying to do this on my own. So he took his own salary and he would use it to give these loans out. And it took him like a decade before people really started taking him seriously. And he had a PhD in economics. And I remember reading his story. He wrote an amazing autobiography called Banker to the Poor, which really changed my life. And he talked about the lows, I mean, he was totally distraught. And he, with all of his experience and all of this evidence, was still getting turned down. So hearing that story, that you could go from people laughing you out of the room to Nobel Peace Prize, but that it might take 20 or 30 years, was really helpful for me. And I think it's also important to realize that the Facebook story that we hear about all the time, like Mark Zuckerberg founding this company in his dorm room in 2004, and then before a decade runs out at IPOs, he becomes a billionaire, that is really, really rare. There are a lot of really successful companies that don't blow up overnight. They take a long time to mature, right? And it's totally valid to start one of those kinds of enterprises, and not all change happens overnight. So sometimes I have to keep reminding myself of that because it gets frustrating. But I think self-doubt is something that you have to battle if you want to do anything really worthwhile.
You guys may not realize it, but so Blue Stamp 2 years ago did the same thing. When Dave gets here later this week, we'll tell you the story behind it. But we got laughed out of the room by a lot of people 2 years ago. Now it's like 60 students across 3 cities. So I'll tell you how we did that and how we overcame it. But like Leila said, the proof is here, right? And you guys are making cool stuff. I know we're about out of time, but maybe just 2 suggestions or a little bit of advice for the youth.
Yeah, well, how many of you guys are thinking about being entrepreneurs someday? Awesome. Any social entrepreneurs? A couple? Cool. Well, one piece of advice would be to really think about building the concept of blended value into your business. Even if you're running a for-profit business, think about a way to build a business that provides long-term value, not just short-term financial returns. So if you're in the tech world, there are a lot of ways to extend the uses of technology to people who normally get excluded. I have a friend who just started an amazing small business loan company that's killing it, and he's the first small business loan company that's not totally screwing people over and charging them ridiculous interest rates. And he's building a for-profit company but doing it in a socially responsible way. And I will say that I think as you get older, I think you feel more and more of an inclination to do something to give back, and you don't need to wait until after you've made a lot of money to do that. You can build those values into whatever kind of company you form, and you can build a profitable company that still gives back. So that'd be one piece of advice. And the second would be just not to give up. So it's a really rough road. A lot of things affect your success, namely luck and timing, and a lot of things beyond your control. And so don't feel like if your first idea doesn't knock it out of the park that you're going to fail. Just realize that that's it's a long-term commitment to be an entrepreneur. And a lot of really successful entrepreneurs started with several failures before they had any success. Cool. Thanks so much.
Thank you.